Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today's workshop is Qualitative Data Analysis with Dr. Megan Lee. Before we get going, just a few bits and pieces of news to share. I encourage you to become a member of the Postgraduate Association, and in that way, we keep all these great workshops going all year that are free for students, and I'll pop that link in the chat box. Just a reminder too that we are recording and we upload these workshops to the SCPA YouTube channel, and I'll post that link as well. Next week, there is no workshop. I'll be on the Gold Coast campus. What's Wednesday, the 5th of March for orientation. So if you're nearby the campus, drop in and have a chat and pick up a few giveaways. Then the following week, we're back again with Megan Lee, and she's going to take us through Statistics Can Be Fun. That starts on Wednesday, the 12th of March, and it's a series of 4 workshops in a row. The following 4 weeks are all based on statistics and SPSS. So I'll also post those links in the chat box, so keep an eye out. Okay, thanks so much, Megan. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Alison. And I always begin every one of my workshops with a big call out to the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. I started my PhD in 2018, 2017, around there. I finished in 2022, so it must have been 2018. I was a member of the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association for the entirety of my PhD. I was highly involved in the Praxis conference. And when things got a little bit rocky for me in my PhD, the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association was one of the biggest supports that I had at the time. And I would highly, highly recommend joining if you haven't already. I don't think I would have finished my PhD if it wasn't for the support of the Postgrad Association. I also developed some really close friendships with other students, other PhD students through the SCPA at all of the campuses, Coffs Harbour, Lismore, and the Gold Coast. And we started doing writing retreats out the back of Byron Bay in Nashua, where we would all sit and write together. And I still am really good friends with those students now. In fact, we're all writing a paper at the moment on the benefits of writing groups for completion of a PhD. So the Southern Cross Postgrad Association actually facilitated those writing retreats. So I couldn't give more praise to the SCPA in helping students in their journey. A little bit about me. I'm Dr. Megan Lee. I'm now at Bond University. I did my PhD at Southern Cross Uni. I graduated in 2022. I'm now an assistant professor at Bond. And I'm a bit of a unicorn when it comes to data analysis and statistics. So I am a mixed methods researcher, which means that I don't believe that you can get to the truth of knowledge through either qualitative or quantitative data analysis alone. And I believe that the two should always be incorporated together. So I do run the quantitative data analysis Statistics Can Be Fun courses over the 4 weeks, but I also am quite knowledgeable in qualitative data analysis, which is what we are doing today. If you were unable to come to last week's workshop on qualitative research methods, I would recommend going back and watching that recording where we just went through what types of methods there are, how qualitative research is done, and the things that you need to keep in mind ethically that are a little bit different to quantitative data analysis. Today, we will focus on the actual analysis technique, mainly of reflexive thematic analysis, which is the most commonly used technique. But we will go through the other ones as well. My research is based in food and mental health. So I am, if you want to follow me on the socials, I'm Food Mood Doctor. I also have a website, the Food Mood Doctor website. You can find all of the presentations through the SCPA on that website as well in the presentations tab. So if there are ones from previous years that you've missed, you can go back and watch them as well. So let's get into it. So what we will be covering today, so we will be diving into qualitative data analysis. So looking at how to take your data from, say, your interviews, your focus groups, or from open-ended surveys, and putting them into the NVivo software program, how to analyze the data, and then what the next steps are after that. Keeping in mind that this is not an NVivo specific workshop on how to use NVivo. So there's a lot of functions that NVivo is really good at using. I'm not going to take you through those today. Robert Lingard will be doing two specific workshops on NVivo and how NVivo works and all of the intricacies behind all of the different functions and fun things that you can do in there. Today, we will be just using it as a software platform to show you how qualitative analysis is done. The most important thing about qualitative analysis is reflexivity. So we will be covering that again. We did that last week, but we'll be covering that in more depth and why that is so important. Then we will dive into reflexive thematic analysis, which has been made famous by the wonderful Virginia Braun and Victoria Clark out of University of Auckland, I think they are at the moment. And then we will be doing a practical example from an interview that I have completed, which has been completely de-identified. So the person should not be able to be identified in the workshop. So before we get into that, let's find out a little bit about yourself. So there's 28 of us today in the workshop. If you can type into the chat box, what course you are currently completing. So are you a PhD? Are you an honours student? Are you doing a Masters of Research? Are you doing a Masters by coursework? What field your degree is in, what your topic is, and what your interest is in qualitative data analysis. Are you going to be using it? Or are you here just to learn a little bit more about how analysis works? Anthony is doing a PhD in mental health nursing using the Safe Woods model. Very good. Philippa's psychology of honours, just here to learn. Philippa, have you got your supervisors yet? So this might be something to consider for future, Alison, is that the honours students from the last two workshops hadn't gotten their supervisors yet and didn't know what their topics were going to be. So maybe pushing back the next year to when they are.
Later in the year.
Maybe just something to think about.
Sure.
They can always go back and rewatch the workshops after they've got their topics, but that's just something that was noticed. Yeah. Courtney, PhD in psychological safety in elite sport. Excellent. NRLW using reflexive thematic analysis. Awesome. I'm really interested in that. Very much so. That's very, very cool. Courtney, have you heard the podcast by Keegan Hipgrave? He played for Parramatta and for the Titans, and he now has a podcast where he interviews elite athletes from NRL, from AFL, from NRLW, from AFLW, and other sports about psychological safety, stigma, mental health stigma in sports. It's just amazing. It sounds like something that would be right up your alley.
I haven't actually listened to his podcast, but he is a friend, and I have a close relationship with the RLPA, which is great. So, but I'll definitely have to jump on. Everybody keeps telling me to. It's just another one to add to the list.
It's phenomenal, and Keegan is he's so good at interviewing. He's very charismatic, and It's
Yeah.
just great. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
No worries. Psychology honours, not sure what I will be doing yet. PhD, Vicky, in Indigenous health, using it to analyse focus groups and open-end survey questions. So today will be very helpful for that. Part-time thesis will be next year. Okay, Philippa. Psych honours. Anthony's doing a qualitative study, wanting to know about the different approaches he can use. Great. We'll go through all of the different data analysis techniques today. Honours, here to learn about interviewing. PhD in psychology, intersection of personal and professional development of psychedelic therapy therapists, mostly qual interviews, Matt. Ooh, that sounds very cool. So interviewing therapists about whether they prescribe or use psychedelics in therapy, that's very, very cool. PhD social ecological marine science for Taylor, lots of social surveys with fishes, nice. Lauren, PhD in early childhood education, considering whether tertiary programs are preparing educators for the workplace. Just about to commence my first round of data analysis using RTA. Awesome. That definitely will be helpful for today. Zach, a Master of Philosophy, Business and Leadership, helpful to learn for his data analysis. Computing and data science degree, interested in this topic. David, PhD, young people with incarcerated parents and education. Oh, good. Semi-structured interviews. Marley's doing a PhD using interpretive phenomenology. Awesome. Matt, a health PhD, chiropractic philosophy. Mostly done his pilot quant data and 25 interviews over 3 cohorts. Excellent. David, PhD, mixed reality and health education, refreshing his knowledge of qual analysis. Declan's PhD, cognitive and experimental psychology, looking at color emotion associations. That's really cool. Wants to add qualitative methods. My friend did her master's in photography using emotion associations. It's very cool. Amber, PhD in site experience in PAT. I'm considering doing some quali. Awesome. So everybody who's here today, I think will definitely benefit from what we are looking at. So let's have a look. So the first part of the workshop, we will talk about the different types of analysis that you can use. And you will help me come up with some examples of research questions that can be answered using that type of analysis. Then we will move on to reflexivity and the importance of reflexivity in qualitative and data analysis. I truly believe reflexivity is also important in quantitative data analysis, and that the skills that I teach you today really should cross over into your quant analysis. It's not yet a thing, but there are papers starting to be written on reflexivity and quantitative analysis, so I'm really excited about that. Then we'll have a break, and then we will move into using NVivo to start the reflexive thematic analysis process. So the reason that we are focusing on reflexive thematic analysis today is because it is the most commonly used technique. It is easy to understand, and for beginners, it's probably the best one to start with when it comes to qualitative analysis. But of course, your analysis should always follow your research aim or your research question, and you shouldn't just retrofit a reflexive thematic analysis if your research question doesn't suit that type of analyses. So let's go. So analyzing qualitative research, there are several different ways, and we're going to go through these in more detail, and we're going to look at an example of a research question that can be used to with these different qualitative analyses, and then you'll give me an example that you come up with. Now, during this exercise, feel free to use Google, feel free to try and think of one in your own head. feel free to play around with generative AI. I really find that the use of generative AI to like spitball ideas and come up with ideas is a really good use of the tool rather than getting it to write things for you. So I would highly recommend trialing that out and see what it comes up with. So the different types of qualitative analysis that we will be looking at today: narrative and content analysis. These are the types of analysis where we study the patterns of communication in text. Most commonly used if we are looking at, say, a hashtag on Facebook or Instagram and wanting to see what everyone has said in that hashtag, or going through a Facebook group and looking at the different conversations that are happening in a Facebook group, things like that. So very commonly used for social media, but also in historical documents and things like that. Newspapers are a really common use of this type of analysis as well. Then there's discourse analysis. This is the study of not the content of written word, but of the sequences of sentences, the way that discourse is done. So it's a very different technique in understanding what's going on behind what participants are saying. Grounded theory is coding categories that are grounded in the data. So that is another way of analyzing qualitative research. I am not an expert in grounded theory. I have never used it myself. So I'm also learning today with grounded theory. But then there's thematic analysis. Thematic analysis, as I said, is the most commonly used one. There are different types of thematic analysis that are used. They all follow the same sort of technique of identifying, analyzing, and interpreting patterns of meaning through codes and themes. So categorizing what participants have said in your analysis. So let's first look at narrative analysis. Its focus is on examining the stories or accounts people provide to understand how they make sense of their experiences. So, and this is why social media is a really good one of this, to use narrative analysis, because everything that's on there is publicly accessible. You kind of waive your rights away when you sign up to Facebook and Instagram. They basically allow you, they can use your data, whatever you say, for whatever they want, which means also that researchers like us can go in there, access anything that's been said on those platforms and not really need ethics to do so. The approach with narrative analysis is to analyze the structure, content, and context of the narratives. So, for example, if you're looking at a hashtag, a lot of my research is in postpartum body image. And if I wanted to look at a postpartum hashtag and just see what mums are saying about their bodies, that's probably going to get me a much richer set of data than interviewing mums about their body image. Because for some reason, people are their most honest, like unfiltered selves when they're posting on these social platforms, rather than sitting down interviewing or having focus groups. So it is a really good way, particularly to find out about sensitive topics, and finding out when people have these very polarizing opinions of things. Narrative analysis of social media or even newspapers and historical documents is really good for getting at the true, honest opinions of people. An example of this, it's commonly used in psychology to explore things. So my example that I created was to explore how individuals cope with trauma by analyzing their personal stories. Now, we could do that through social media. We could do that through, say, patients who, or like psychology patients who write diaries or stories, who allow us to access those things, stuff like that. So narrative analysis is always kind of like a written word storytelling type stuff. So what I'd get you to do is, using Google or coming up with something in your own head or using generative AI, come up with an example of a research question that we could answer using narrative analysis. I'll give you a couple of moments to do that. How do cancer survivors narrate their experience of resilience in autobiographies? That's really good. See, I told you, generative AI comes up with the goods. Yeah, so the cancer survivors may keep diaries or autobiographies. You could go back and do a systematic search, maybe through ProQuest, looking at historical documents and autobiographies of cancer survivors, bring them all together in your data and apply a narrative analysis to those autobiographies. That could even be an entire PhD, to be honest. Thanks, Charlene. That was amazing. What is the lived experience of home carers for a terminal cancer patient? Yes, Anthony, that's good. I wonder how we would get the narrative, where we would get their stories from. Would you get them to complete diaries while they were caring for their loved one who had terminal cancer, things like that? Connie, how do elite athletes narrate their mental health experience through publicly shared podcasts? And what themes emerge in their stories about psychological challenges and coping strategies in high performance sport? Interesting that you say that, Courtney, because I have talked to Keegan about potentially using his podcast as a PhD.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, well, we should talk later because I suppose I think I've conducted 40 interviews thus far for my PhD, but it's essentially talking through these same experiences. So,
yeah, and the one that we do today, the reflexive thematic analysis, is probably the way to go with word that's spoken, particularly interview style. So you'll get a lot out of that later when we start looking into that.
yes,
Right?
I did use RTA last year for my honours thesis, and I have learnt how much I did wrong now. This is why I'm back here.
There is no wrong in qualitative research.
No, yeah, there is with words that you use. It's very pedantic. I'm learning. I'm going
Yeah.
through a peer review process, so it's been actually great. A great learning, yeah, curve.
Oh, totally. Qualitative research is actually, I believe, harder than quant. Like,
Yeah.
lots of students are like, oh, I'll do a qualitative research project because I'm scared of statistics. And then they start qualitative and they're like, oh.
Yeah. And because we don't really do it in our undergrad, so there's a lot we don't know. So I think finding a supervisor who's a real expert in qual is really handy.
Yes, Sally Sargent at SCU is one of the best
Yeah,
ones
she's
if you are
lovely.
interested. Yeah.
Courtney, that'd be wonderful to find out what words they're picking on, particularly in that review process. Whether that's a chat another time, but that's a fascinating one.
Yes. Yeah, it's pretty detailed, but it's really important to make sure that the match between your philosophy and your analysis, and then the words scattered throughout the way the results are written, really align. So especially for RTA, you know, you can't say things like emerged and identified. It's all about, you know, with the philosophy I use, it was all about
Well, to be honest, that's a faux pas that Braun and Clark have suggested, but yeah, there's pushback on that now.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
it's like they're making rules, but
Yeah.
the whole point of qualitative research is that there shouldn't be rules.
No
So
rules.
what were the other, because that's the thing I've read too, like that they don't like emerge and identified. Like what were the words that they're liking instead? How did they just, what's the sentence?
So essentially they haven't told me what words they like, but I've just had to go and do my research. But I think it's all about co-construction, you know, and the fact that we generated things together as researcher and interviewer participant. So it's and all about perspective as well, not so you know, you can't be as strong in your wording of sentences, I think. I don't know if that makes sense, but they've really raised a lot of points around softening some of the language because it
Yeah,
is
and
someone's
that's true.
experience. And I agree with it too. And
They
sometimes you
just
don't
don't
really
want
notice
us.
you're saying it.
Yeah, they just don't want us to insinuate that the themes popped out of nowhere, like
Yeah.
that you were very involved in the process of constructing and creating the themes. A lot of qualitative research is written like themes emerged from
Yes.
this, and then it's like, how did they just emerge? It's like it's just the use of language, and qualitative researchers are very particular about linguistics and grammar and language and construction of sentences. So it's, yeah, that's why.
And
But
the hard thing is if you are sort of following along another paper, you pick up their habits, I suppose. And that's probably been difficult when you know, you're advised to follow a certain paper, but then
yeah,
you know, there's some mismatch. So it's all a learning curve. And you know, I'm better for it, but yeah,
it's
it's
interesting that
fascinating.
identified has been now black banned as well. I didn't know that, so that's
Well, that
new.
was, yeah. So because that's the one that I use. I've never used emerge, but identified has been one that I have used. But yeah,
Well, that's the
try
one
not
that
to
I
use
do use.
identified.
So
Yeah,
there you
try not to
go.
use that
And
one.
things are
Is
always
that
changing.
is that interesting? Like it's particularly in semi-structured interviews where you've got a bunch of words that you're using as prompts, then that, you know, it tries to be neutral, but it can also be leading, or it can also, you know, like there's a whole discussion around the words you use in the semi-structured interview process.
Absolutely. And ethics should be all over that, but because the ethics committee is usually made up of people who are quantitative researchers, they might not be as stringent on those semi-structured interview questions being the way that they are. So
Yeah.
you just have to be very careful that you're not leading your participants when you're creating your interview guides. But there's a whole argument out there in the qualitative research world about lots of things. There's also the COREC guidelines, which is kind of like Prisma or Strobe for qualitative research, which is a checklist of things that you've included in your methods section and your results section to ensure that the paper is written in a systematic way. Braun and Clark are now pushing against the COREC guidelines as well. And I've always used them because it's helpful to structure your argument in your paper. But so again, it's like, well, qualitative research is supposed to be flexible and individualized for each case. So the COREC guidelines kind of push it into a quantitative mind frame. Like, so there's lots
How do you
going
spell
on.
that, Megan?
COREQ. I think it's something like the consolidated requirements for qualitative research, something like that. But yeah, some journals want you to use it and will push back in peer review if you haven't, and some journals require you not to use it. So figure that out before you submit. All right, we'll move on to the next example. Actually, there was a really good one in here that I wanted to read out by ChatGPT. Narrative analysis can be used to examine how activists frame their personal and collective experiences in movements like climate change activism or Indigenous land rights. Researchers could study speeches, protests, slogans, personal testimonies to understand how narratives shape public engagement and policy influence. So that one was a really good one. Thank you for that. The next type of analysis, which is very similar to narrative analysis, is content analysis, where very similar kind of written word stuff, historical documents, newspapers, hashtags, social media, written word, but it systematically categorizes and quantifies the content of that communication through themes and frequencies within the data. So content analysis is kind of on the borderline of quali and quant, because it is one of the only qualitative analyses that kind of counts frequencies. So its goal is to provide a quantitative description of the content. So how many times in this postpartum hashtag did mums talk about negative body image? How many times did they talk about positive body image? How many times did they mention the word mumfluences? Things like that. It's commonly used in media studies to analyze the frequency of certain themes, particularly in news articles. So you could go through historical news articles over time and see how often one topic or one theme comes up. I'll get you to provide an example of a research question where we could use content analysis. And I'll read a few of them out. Here we go. ChatGPT. Researchers could analyze political speeches and campaign materials to see how often politicians use key phrases like climate justice, economic inequality, or mental health crisis to understand shifts in political messaging over time. So see how it's similar to narrative analysis, where the type of data that we use is written word, historical, over time, but content analysis looks at how many times something is said. How do companies communicate their commitment to psychological safety in their sustainability reports? Yeah, so going back through those reports and seeing how often companies communicate their commitment to psychological safety, that's really good. Oh, good one, Matt. What is the balance between good news and bad news stories in weekend newspapers? Excellent. I can just imagine what I hypothesize that to be. So I don't watch the news or read newspapers or look at social media that much for this reason, because the bad news stories outweigh the good news stories, don't they? So that's really, really interesting. That would be a really cool thing to do. You would have so much data though. How would you refine the boundaries of the data for that? But that's a really good example. Thank you. All right, discourse analysis. So discourse analysis examines how language is used in text and context to construct meaning and social reality. It analyzes language communication patterns and the social context in which discourse occurs. So quite often discourse analysis is really interested in how words are said, pauses in communication, giggles, sighs, and it's completely analyzed in a different way to other written word. So we use codes and tags within the discourse analysis to exemplify big pauses, whether something was said loud, in a soft voice, a quiet voice, a sad voice. There's all sorts of coding of how the discourse was said rather than what was said or the content. Its goal is to understand the relationship between language, power, and society. An example is it is used in sociolinguistics to study how political speeches influence public opinion and shape social norms by looking at how that speech is said. Alison, you said that you use discourse analysis in your PhD, is that right? Are you there? Yes.
Here.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you use discourse analysis in your PhD?
Sure. So I access historical patient files of mothers institutionalized in the 1920s and 30s. So I use discourse analysis and also content analysis about the way the language, how analyzing the language of doctors and how they kind of constructed gender through the way they talked about unwell mothers. Very much traditional gendered roles. A mother must devote her time to children and not work and all that sort of stuff. So just it's like analyzing the themes and in that discourse analysis way that you talk about there, kind of getting at the gendered power of language to construct unwell mothers. Yeah.
Wow, excellent. And what did you find? What was kind of your overall findings for your PhD?
In terms of this kind of analysis of, well, the 1920s and 30s in Australia, women didn't have much power, social power or financial power, and they were subject to the power of their husbands, psychiatrists, and whatever to lock them away. So yeah.
The hysterical woman who needs to go to the mental health
very much so.
institution.
But they didn't have much of an understanding of psychology and social issues like poverty and whatever. So,
Yeah, amazing. It sounds like it would have been a very interesting and powerful PhD.
it was a bit dark.
Yes. And how did you look after yourself whilst doing a PhD that was very much like that?
Yeah, I had no idea how kind of heavy emotionally it would be. I had some really good friends. I probably drank too much.
Like we all do during our PhD.
Occasionally, had some really good friends that I could debrief with, like that were outside the university. So that's really helpful. People that are critical friends, like they're interested, but they're not part of the university. So it was really important for me. Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes a really important thing to consider is the topic that you are going to do for any research, whether it's PhD, honors, masters of research, you have to look after yourself, because if you are particularly in a PhD where you are diving into a topic for 3 to 4 years, really protecting your mental health. And when we get to the reflexivity activity in a moment, that's all part of it as well. The reflexivity of how you are managing your own psychological safety whilst you're doing your research. If you're doing a topic that could be traumatizing for yourself, you have to be aware of that through reflexivity.
Yes.
All right. So can we provide an example of a research question where we would use discourse analysis? Charlene, how does social media influencers use language to construct authenticity? Great. I told you these generative AI programs would do a good job of this. Oh, it's great. A researcher could analyze political speeches, debates, or media interviews to examine how politicians construct narratives around climate change policy by studying word choices, metaphors, and framing. Discourse analysis can reveal how language influences public perception, policy decisions, and activism strategies. What I really love about this is that the examples here on the exact same topic of political science and activism are showing us that each research question can be used in a different way or looked at in a different way using the different types of analysis. So we've had an example for this for narrative, content, and discourse, and they've all been different ways of analyzing very similar data. So thank you very much for who is sharing those. All right, next, grounded theory. Now, I will definitely say grounded theory is not my area of expertise. I know very little about how this works. So we might have to really rely on everyone else and generative AI to help us with this one. So grounded theory develops theories grounded in the data collected from your participants. It involves iterative data collection, analysis, coding, and comparisons. Its goal is to generate a theory that explains a process, action, or interaction. An example, used in sociology to develop a theory about how people adapt to major life changes such as retirement or chronic illness based on interviews and observations. So let's have a look at an example of a research question we could use using grounded theory to clarify this a little bit more. What are the emergent coping mechanisms of healthcare workers during a pandemic? Good. So kind of using something that is grounded in the data already to develop a theory. It's kind of flipping science on its head a little bit, isn't it? What else have we got? Oh, here we go. So again, the political science and activist example. So this will really help us to understand the differences. A researcher studying grassroots activism could conduct interviews with climate activists and analyze their responses using grounded theory. Instead of starting with a predefined theory, the researcher would identify emerging themes, there's that word, such as motivations for activism, barriers to engagement, or perceptions of government inaction, and develop a new theoretical framework explaining how and why people become politically engaged in climate movements. So it's basically using the data to develop new theories. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Is this a
That's
little bit like,
clarified grounded theory for me as well.
Megan, is it a little bit like, the evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence kind of flip?
Yeah. Yeah, so using your research to develop theory. So like going the opposite way to the scientific method, really, where you collect data from a theory. This is going the other way around. Yeah, it's cool. Thematic analysis. So this one is the most common. There are several different types of thematic analysis depending on what your research question is. So making sure that you go out and really research which one is best used for what you want to do. The basics of thematic analysis is that you identify and analyze patterns or themes within the data using coding of the data. It involves coding, searching for themes, reviewing the themes, defining and naming themes, and producing a report. Its goal is to provide a detailed and nuanced understanding of the data by highlighting key themes that explain and explore the participants' experiences through their eyes, which is what phenomenology is, right? So looking at the participants' experiences whilst removing your own preconceived ideas of the topic. Used in psychology to explore common themes in patients' descriptions of their experiences with therapy, helping to understand the impact of therapeutic interventions. So, could you come up with a research question where we could use thematic analysis? Keeping in mind that thematic analysis is the one that is most commonly used for interview and focus group studies and for exploring open-ended questions in surveys, which is why it's the most commonly used, because that's the most common ways of collecting qualitative data. How do First Nations people determine whether an occupational therapist is able to deliver culturally safe care? Oh, yeah. So you could do interviews and focus groups. You could do yarning circles. They're really, really commonly used now in qualitative research for Indigenous communities, where we are using the ways of knowing and learning from the Indigenous perspective. And it's really important when we do research with Indigenous First Nations peoples that we also include an elder from the Indigenous group that we are planning to collect data from, to be involved in the research from the research design stage all the way through to reporting and being involved in the writing of the research. Thematic analysis in political science and activism. A researcher analysing social media discussions on protest movements could use thematic analysis to identify recurring themes in tweets, Facebook posts, or activist interviews. Themes might include government distrust, urgency for action, intergenerational responsibility, or systemic injustice. This method helps uncover common concerns, values, and mobilization strategies within activist communities. Very good. Courtney, for my honours thesis, I explored NRL and NRLW players' experiences with stressors through an abductive approach to thematic analysis. Good. Vicky's been doing a series of yarns for First Nations people. Excellent qualitative research design and very culturally appropriate, which is great. I'm really excited to see this in qualitative research. How do parents of children with ADHD experience and navigate their child's diagnosis? That's an excellent one. Interviews or focus groups. Probably interviews for that one, because the topic is a little sensitive to be discussing in a group setting. But yeah, very, very good. Right. So reflexive thematic analysis is the most common form of thematic analysis. I would highly recommend, if you are doing a RTA, to read Braun and Clark's Thematic Analysis, a Practical Guide. It summarizes all of the papers that they've written in the past and the updates. It was written in or published in 2022, I believe. So it's recent. It does dive into some real philosophical, theoretical frameworks at the beginning, so slough through those bits. But it does go through each of the stages of thematic analysis and how they should be used. It also talks about the words emerged and not identified yet, because that's new. That's a new one. But get this book. It's only small. And have a read if you are going to be doing reflexive thematic analysis, particularly in your PhD. Reflexive thematic analysis focuses on examining themes and patterns of meaning within data by coding your participants' interviews, focus groups, or open-ended questions line by line. There is a large focus on reflexivity, which we're going to get to in a second. And we will go through the 6 stages of thematic analysis after the break. So reflexivity, as I said before, reflexivity, that's the very first word in reflexive thematic analysis. If you don't do a reflexive or a reflexive process during your thematic analysis, you cannot say that you've done reflexivity, or you can't say that you've done an RTA. This is the most important part of reflexive thematic analysis. So, and it needs to be written somewhere in your methods section. There should be a paragraph on how you used reflexivity, that you kept a reflexive journal, and potentially disclosing some of the biases that you may have on your topic. For example, we're writing a paper on 27 interviews with Australian vegan men and their experiences with the motivations to become vegan and their social identity. And in that paragraph, we disclose that about 6 of the 7 researchers in the project are female, and none of us are actually vegan. There are different levels of plant-based dietary adherence in our group, but most of us are omnivores or flexitarians. None of us are vegan. So really reflecting on who we are and everything that we have done up to this research and how that could impact our every stage of the data analysis. So from developing the research design through to which analysis you chose to use, so reflexive thematic analysis, to collecting your data, how you like engage with your participants, all the different things, what you've said to the participants, through to interpreting the data, through to writing the report. You should be keeping a reflexive journal at all stages to mitigate and acknowledge your biases, your preconceived ideas, the values that you bring to the topic, and not just about your topic, but about other topics in the world and research itself. What you believe about qualitative research, what you believe about quantitative research, what you believe about mixing the methods, how the things that have happened to you in your research life that have brought you to the researcher that you are. That's all part of reflexivity. So we're going to do an exercise for the last kind of 10 minutes of this first half of the workshop, and then we'll go for a break. So reflexivity involves the researcher reflecting on how they are positioned in relation to the research and the participants. A journal should be kept from the inception of the project all the way through to when you publish, and you should be reflecting on everything that you have experienced in your life and how that impacts how you interpret and understand the research. Noting your gender, your social privilege, your sexuality, your race, your age, your immigration status, your beliefs about gender and queer theory, your beliefs about abortion, feminism, racism, white male privilege, Indigenous and disability rights, your political leanings, what you believe about euthanasia and the sex industry, and how you are positioned as a researcher in your topic. Are you an insider researcher, which means are you the same as the population? So in the postpartum body image research I do, I'm an insider researcher because I'm a mum. In the vegan men research that I do, I'm an outsider researcher because I'm not a vegan. I'm also not a man. So how do you position yourself? I'm going to give everybody this PowerPoint and the resource that we're going to use from Braun and Clark's book on how to do reflexivity. So it's a little exercise that they have developed for the first entry in your reflexive journal. So this is the first thing that you do, acknowledging your biases and your preconceived beliefs, morals, opinions, and perspectives. And then throughout the study, you go back to your reflexive journal and you note your ideas about what is happening, how your beliefs are changing because of your interaction with your participants or interaction with the literature, and always coming back to the reflexive journal throughout the process. So for the next, let's say 6 minutes, I'm going to get you to think about how you're positioned in relation to research. Write down your beliefs, your opinions, your perspectives, how they could influence your design, your data collection, your interaction with participants, your analysis, and your report writing. And then after that, we'll go for a break until like 10 past. Is that all right, Alison?
Yep, sounds great.
Okay, so you can use the whole 15 minutes to do this exercise if you like, or you can do the exercise for 5 or 10 minutes and use the rest to go and have a break. Keep in mind that a reflexive journal should never be shared with anybody. It is your own personal account. And if someone ever asks you to share it, it is going against the whole purpose of the exercise. Because if you know that someone is going to read your reflexive journal, you will not be writing into that journal the things that are important. So I will not be asking anyone to share their reflexivity, so you can keep it all to yourself. All right.
Okay. So we're back at like 10 past the hour. Is that right?
That sounds good to me.
All right, great.
Is everybody back? I'll just cover Matt's question before we move on. So how do you deal with that in a thesis? So this is a really good question. And in a thesis, in a PhD and an honors thesis, I would probably really spend some time describing your reflexive activity. So acknowledging who you are as a researcher, who you are, everything that's happened to you up to the point of the thesis that has developed the way that you think about research to begin with. What you believe about qualitative research, what you believe about quantitative research, really have a deep philosophical understanding of how all of those things, say how you were taught, say in psychology, we get taught 4 statistics, quantitative statistics units. And usually when you come out the end of a psychology degree, you are very entrenched in the scientific method and how quantitative research and positivism works. And very little qualitative research is explored. Although I'm trying to change that at Bond in particular. I'm not sure about SCU, whether they do any quality research in their statistics units. But acknowledging that, if you come from education, on the other hand, you will be deeply entrenched in qualitative theory and ontology, epistemology. And when I came out the back end of my psychology degree, I didn't even know what those words meant. So really acknowledging what has happened to you in research and in your degree previously, and then moving on to how the things that have happened to you in your life, and not disclosing personal information, but how things in your life have brought you to where you are personally in relation to yourself. You don't have to acknowledge your sexuality or your race or things about like that. But if I was doing a PhD on my, say, plant-based diet and mental health stuff, I would probably talk about whether I've been plant-based before, whether I'm plant-based during my thesis, why those choices, things like that, which positions you as like an insider or an outsider research, really talking about that. In my body image research, I probably would describe like my experiences as a mum, my own body image, without telling people too much about my own personal information, but acknowledging, yes, I'm a mum. I may have had body image concerns around after pregnancy, and just exploring those types of things about yourself that you feel comfortable about. And then finally moving on to how your biases could influence the research. So say for the Australian vegan men research, I acknowledge that the fact that I am not a man, I've never been a man, I can never understand the world through the eyes of a man. And that may influence the way that I interpret the research, things like that. So for theses, it's probably really worth dedicating quite a large chunk of your thesis to the reflexiveness. Whereas with a paper, you'd put in a paragraph saying whether you're an insider or an outsider researcher, that a reflexive journal was kept to acknowledge your biases, and you would kind of leave it at that. But I think for a thesis, it would be, you'd get an examiner would look very highly upon that if they were a qualitative or a mixed methods researcher. Especially if you're doing RTA, it's kind of the foundation of the whole analysis process. So that was a really good question.
Can I add a
Yes.
little bit to that? Totally,
Yeah.
totally on board with what you said. What also would be powerful is, so as you say, you kind of make your standpoint, like where you're coming from, what brought you to that research to begin with. And once you can collect data, how did that data change your mind? How did that data change the way you think about your research topic? How did that data, you know, give you new insights about the topic? So that's just to kind of tag in at the end, in a way, that reflexive approach.
Yeah, I agree.
How did it
In your
change you?
conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is a question about, would that be a paragraph or more like a page? In a scientific journal article, it'd be a small paragraph, but for a thesis, it would be in the front material. And I know in a PhD, you have a specific section where you do talk about who you are and how you're approaching your thesis. And so that would be a really good, and I would say I would use a half a page to a full page on that with those three key sections. The first one is, how are you positioned as a researcher? What do you feel about the scientific method, quantitative, qualitative? Then move on to how the things that have happened to you in your life have shaped who you are and what you believe about the world. So ontology, epistemology, the ways of knowing and being. And then the third bit about who you are in relation to the research topic itself and how that could influence the interpretation of the data and your interaction with participants. So those three key sections should be in a thesis. Maybe for an honors thesis, a little smaller, but definitely for a PhD, half a page to a full page disclosing your positioning. And it would go in the front. Never put your reflexive journal in the appendix. The reflexive journal itself should never be disclosed to anyone else. That is your own personal thing and should be kept personal. Good questions. Do we have any other questions about the reflexive component of reflexive thematic analysis before we move into the analysis component? So far, okay, cool. So the example we are going to be using in the tutorial is from an interview with a mum about her experiences of body image, eating attitudes, and mental health in the postpartum period. So really quickly, before we go into the data, it's really important to consider qualitative research ethics. They are a little bit different to quantitative research ethics because in most part, you can't really ensure confidentiality and anonymity, particularly if you are doing focus group studies where there's 6 to 8 participants all in a room having a conversation. You have no control over whether people will take that conversation outside of the research area. We do ask participants to keep the information confidential, but as I said, the researcher has no control over that after the fact. So, and particularly if you're looking at analysis of survey questions or public information like on social media, obviously that's not confidential either. So in qualitative research, ethics is done a little bit differently. So informed consent, usually in qualitative research, informed consent will be the click of a survey button to ensure that the participants agree to doing the survey, or a written informed consent where they write down and sign that they have consented. In qualitative research, quite often the informed consent can be verbal as long as it's recorded. But participants should always be informed about the study, the procedure, the risks and the benefits of the study. To protect confidentiality and anonymity, once we have audio recorded our interviews, focus groups, or other types of research, we need to protect the participant's identity by de-identifying them in the transcript, so the Word documents of the transcript. And then the audio recordings need to be kept on in the university's safe repository, data repository, where no one from the ether can access those audio recordings because they have identifying information on them. But all transcripts should be de-identified. So no names, all names should be taken out, partners' names, children's names, their names, where they work, if they mention what school they study at, even the suburb they live in, we would take that out or change it. Pseudonyms are quite common. Sometimes we ask our participants if they would like to nominate a pseudonym. Sometimes we just nominate them ourselves, things like that. All participation should be voluntary without coercion. In a focus group study, if a participant wishes to leave, we cannot remove their previously spoken data from the forum. So in the ethics application, you must always state that the participants will be informed that their data cannot be removed once they leave. That's really important because otherwise the context of the rest of the data might not make sense. Participants should always leave the research in the same psychological and physical state as they entered the research. So quite commonly, people could get upset in interviews or focus groups, and there must always be some form of way that we ensure that the participants are not harmed in any way. Numbers for Lifeline, things like that. If it's in a university setting, the university's EAP program or the student counselling services, things like that need to be on hand just in case. So reflexive thematic analysis using Braun and Clark's 6 stages of thematic analysis starts with familiarization of your data. We are going to go through these 6 stages in more detail as we use some real life data, and I'll explain them as we go. We then move on to the coding phase where we create code labels in NVivo, and then there's several different ways of creating categories and codes and then themes. And I might ask Courtney later on how she did hers, because I always use a post-it system, which I'll show you later. You then create your themes, review your themes, define your themes, and you write your thematic analysis. The difference quite commonly with quantitative and qualitative data report writing is that the data analysis process does not end before you start writing your report. It's a consistent backwards and forwards, forwards and backwards through these 6 stages. You could be writing your report and have to go all the way back through to the coding phase, because once you're writing up the themes, you realize that things have completely changed. So the report writing is also part of the data analysis. Right, so let's move on to NVivo. So NVivo is a software program specifically used for qualitative data analysis. As I said before, Robert Lingard is doing 2 workshops specifically on the ins and outs of the functionality of NVivo. I won't be doing that today. I don't want to steal his thunder. So I'm just going to show you how to use it for reflexive thematic analysis. So the very first step is to log into NVivo. You should have free access to this through SCU. If you don't, contact your supervisor and IT to get that for you. Name your project. So I've named this body image postpartum because the interview is the very first interview we ever did in our postpartum interview study. Interview 1, I want the context to be in UK English, and click next. Then the next step, and I'm going to get into NVivo in a second and do a bit of a live analysis, but the next step is to import your data using the import tab. So we import our data into here. So we just take our Word document or our Excel file or our PDF, and we import it through the Files button. Click on Browse and Import. And this is where data familiarization kind of begins, although conducting your interviews and your focus groups in the first place is also part of that first stage of thematic analysis of data familiarization. Then transcribing your audio into your Word document is also part of your data familiarization. We tend to use generative AI programs like Otter now to do that for us. And Zoom itself, if you are doing Zoom online interviews or Teams, they can provide you with a transcript, which can be really helpful. Please keep in mind the generative AI Otter programs and Zoom don't get it completely right. So when transcribing, you need to listen to the audio whilst reading through every line that is said and correct mistakes that the computers make. And they make several. So that is a stage that must be done. Don't just transcribe and hope to analyze this data that is not correctly done. So you have to go through line by line, listening and correcting the audio, the Word document. But these tools have really cut transcribing time. It used to take 4 to 5 hours for a 1 hour interview when we did it manually. Typing and listening, craziness. So it's much speedier and faster using AI, but you do have to go through and correct any mistakes. Then after we've done that, we reread the Word documents over and over and make sure that your entire team is familiar with the data. During these phases, we are close to the data and then we move away from the data in quiet moments of reflection and thinking about the participants' experiences. So what I like to do in these moving away from the data stages is I drive 50 minutes to work. So sometimes if I am analyzing qualitative data, I will sit in the car, not put the radio on and drive and just think about my participants' experiences and the data. Some of my best ideas for qualitative data analysis have happened on a massage table. So get a massage and cognitively focus on your data while you're doing that. Lots of different ways of moving away from the data. So it's very different to quantitative analysis where we are putting the data in, running an analysis, cleaning the data, and then get an answer. There is very much a forwards, backwards, forwards, moving close, moving away from your data throughout the qualitative process. Once we have imported the data into NVivo, we then continue the data familiarization stage, which is still stage 1, reading through the data again and creating memos of interesting quotes that stand out to you. What are some of the quotes that are really salient, really engaging, what are really sticking with you? So write those down and keep them for a bit later on down the track. All right, so then once we've imported our data into NVivo, we then start our coding phase. So the coding phase consists firstly of code labeling. And what we do with code labeling is we go through each line of data that the participant has said, and we code each line with a code label. This next step is to take those code labels. I like to put them on post-it notes. Each code label I write on post-it notes, and this will make more sense in a second when we get into the data. And I put them up all over the wall. And then I start sorting the code labels into categories where they are similar and different. And then eventually you end up with themes, but we'll get to that in a moment. All right, so generating code labels. So let's get into the data itself. I'll exit out of this and hopefully get into NVivo. Hopefully it will let me share. So let me know if you see NVivo when I share. Can we see NVivo?
Yep, no worries, it's good.
Woo! Okay. So I've created the body image in the postpartum project. Will it come up? Good. All right. So I want to import the file, unless it's already in there. Let me just see. No, it doesn't look like it is. Okay. Files. We import our file. It can be a Word file, it can be a PDF, it can be Excel, it can be anything like that. Import it into the program. Just call it interview 1, body image postpartum. Okay. And then we double click to open it. And there we have it. Our file has been imported into NVivo. I like to make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So in the first stage of coding, and as I said, Robert Lingard will go through all of the other things that are in here. I will touch on them later, just briefly, but he will tell you about cases and notes and memos. So that's where you can keep like your quotes, that the salient quotes I just talked about. You can pop them in there, the ones that you think are most important. But for now, we are going to be looking at coding. So just going to codes. So when we start, we are looking at our interview here. And we don't have to code every single piece of information, only the information that answers our research aim or our research question. So a lot of the time, the transcripts will include information like introductory, getting to know you, building rapport type questions that aren't getting to the crux of your actual data. So you don't need to code those things. So for this research project, our aim was to explore the experiences of body image and eating attitudes in the postpartum. So it's very broad, as most qualitative research aims are. So some of the introductory questions were things like, what is the best thing about being a mum? What's the worst thing about being a mum? Just to kind of build rapport and get the participant feeling confident and comfortable in the interview experience. So what we found, though, was that some of those things were important to the data analysis. So make sure that you don't just discard those because you think they're not important. So let's have a look. So when we are coding, we read each line. So in the survey, you mentioned that you've got 3 kids. So how are things going being a mum at the moment? So this, you also don't need to code the interviewer comments, and please try not to. Sometimes you accidentally code something that you've said to a participant and then it ends up as data. So be very careful of not doing that. And the interviewee asks a question with COVID or just in general. So that's not relevant, probably both. So in the survey, you mentioned you've got 3 kids. How are things going being a mum? Okay, it's good. I think 3 kids is a lot easier than it was when it was 1 or 2, for sure. But it's going quite well. It's lonely at times because you can't get out and see people so much. But we make pretty good progress with it. And as you can see in the transcript, we've kept the ums and ahs in. That they can be very important. We also tend to report when someone's stopped, when someone sighs, when someone giggles, when someone laughs, when someone shouts. These are kind of important. If someone says something in a quieter tone than they usually do, we kind of report that as well. So you keep all your ums and ahs in at this stage, and then we remove them at the report writing stage where we clean up our quotes during that process. So I might think that the participant is talking here about having 3 kids is harder than it was when she had 1 or 2. Now, although that's not really talking about body image or eating attitudes, that's kind of setting up maybe for something that she might describe later on about the context of her body image, because having 3 kids might mean that the participant has less time to focus on eating well or exercising, things like that. So maybe this comment is actually important to our data. So what we're trying to do when we create our code labels is we are trying to get at the crux of what the participant is saying. And in qualitative research, there are 2 different types of variables. There's the obvious meaning, when a participant specifically says something and you're like, oh yeah, they're saying this. And then there's sometimes latent meaning, which is what is happening here, is where we kind of underneath what they're saying, the participant is actually saying, I think 3 kids is a lot easier than it was with 1 or 2, for sure. She's actually saying the opposite of what I expected to begin with. And this is going back to reflexivity, right? So I just, in that moment, put my own beliefs and preconceived ideas about having 3 kids being harder than having 1 or 2 and put it onto that sentence until I read it the second time. And the participant is actually saying, I think 3 kids is a lot easier than it was when it was 1 or 2. So see how that just happened in very live data? So I assumed that she was saying that it was harder, but she's actually saying it's easier. So I think that's a very important code. So to create a new code label, we right-click, create new code, and then we have to think of a name for this code. So what is the participant saying in that line? So this might be something like having more kids is easier than maybe we use the word children for kids. Now, keep in mind that there is no wrong or right answer in qualitative research when it comes to code labeling. It's whatever you believe. A lot of students get stuck at this stage and ask me, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? There is no right or wrong. It's just your conception of what the participant is saying. And this is why that reflexive activity is very important, because we can put our own ideas on the participants. So trying not to do that whilst we're coding. What I like to do is provide a description with the code label, because sometimes you'll have hundreds of codes or code labels, and all of a sudden you'll be like, what does that one mean? So I provide a little description for myself. So participant is describing that she feels it is easier having 3 children compared to when it was only 1 or 2. So you can come back to this later and be like, what was I thinking? What does that code label mean? Read your description, and then that can jog your memory. But it can also help you with your interpretation of the data later on as well, at the coding and the thematic stage. A really cool thing that NVivo now does is that you can color code your code labels. So when you go to trying to categorize your code labels into codes and then themes, the color might actually help you. So like I said, I usually use the Post-it system where I put each code label on a Post-it note, pop them up all over the wall, get my research team in together, and we move the Post-its around so that they're in categories and codes and then overall themes. But you can actually do it in vivo now. So say this, we can't really code it now. You'd have to do this later when you know all of the data. But say having more children is easier than less might be coded in magenta. And then maybe other code labels that are similar to that, you could then code in magenta. Okay. So now we have our first code label. So what I like to do is I like to widen it so I can see the entire label. It's not going to allow me to do that without making that one smaller. Because that's the most important thing, right? Your code labels. So make them bigger, which means you have to make your data smaller. Good. Now, the next step in coding is to take the piece of data that is relevant to that and click and drag it into the code. So now in that code label is one file. So if we double click on the code label, that piece of data has then gone into that code label and we can access that anytime. Now, any code label where in the interview, the mum talks about how having more children is easier than having less children, we would drag that piece of data into that code label as well. So it will have many different ones, or it might just have one. Keeping in mind that quantity is not important in thematic analysis, where it is for like content and discourse analysis, but for thematic analysis, it doesn't matter if there's one piece of data in a code label, 20 pieces of data in a code label, it's not relevant to how we report it. Right,
Maybe.
so what's the next? Yes, you have a question?
If that comes up like that, like say halfway through the interview, you get a concept that comes through where she's saying, actually, it's harder, like having more kids for some other, you know, a slightly different thought process. Do you go back and like, do you change the code to challenges with children, positive and negative, or do you make a new code? It's harder with more kids.
You make a new code, and commonly participants will say the complete contradiction of themselves very often. So you would write, having more children is harder than less children. And then when you get to the coding stage, so the next stage after code labeling is coding, where you put all your code labels into categories or codes. Those two, both the positive and the negative form of that code label, would go in the same code. So in the same category, they would be popped in together eventually. Yeah, good. All right, so the next thing that the mum says, it's going quite well. It's lonely at times because you can't get out and see people so much, but we make pretty good progress with it. What's really difficult is, what does that mean? But we make pretty good progress with it. Who's we? Is she talking about herself and her children? Is she talking about herself and her partner? We don't know. So I wouldn't code that unless later on in the interview it becomes very apparent who we is and what progress is she talking about. Progress with what? Because we did ask how things are going and she's saying we make good progress with it. So very often you will have to sit and think about tiny bits of discourse and be like, what is going on here? Right. But she does say it's lonely at times because you can't get out and see people so much. So that might actually be an important part as well. So I would probably create a new code for that one. Being a mum can be lonely. Describes how she is feeling lonely at times after becoming a mum. Although that's not really true because she's got 3, so she hasn't just become a mum. And see how you have to really consider your own thought patterns when you're doing this and make sure that you are truly understanding and interpreting what the participant is saying. So this whole loneliness thing is completely different to the other code on having more children is easier than having less children. So we might code that yellow, and maybe later on some other things about loneliness or the difficulties of being a mum might come up. And so then we take that piece of data, we click and we drag it into the wrong one. Good job, Megan. I will get rid of that one later. So there is a way of removing them. I just got to remember how. That's a job for another time. Right, so it's lonely at times because you get out and see people so much. Make sure you put it in the correct one. There we go. And then we keep going through. So let's have a look. Okay, great. And have you got kids? You're that homeschooling. Someone hasn't transcribed this very well. Homeschooling and things at the moment too, unless that's exactly what they said. And you will find that when you transcribe written word or spoken word, that people do not speak in linear ways. It's really the most interesting part about transcribing is that sentences, when you read them, actually don't often make sense. But when we speak to each other, we don't hear the incongruencies in our speech patterns. It's fascinating. Anyway, homeschooling. My eldest is 3.5. So that's just demographic stuff. So you're not grappling with homeschooling. No, we only just managed to get him into preschool this week, but otherwise I've got a 3.5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and then my youngest is nearly 5 months. Oh, so they're talking about school, which is not relevant to her. None of this has got anything really to do with body image. Let's go down a little bit later. Okay, so here is where the interviewer talks about the survey asked you questions about body image, obviously, and that's, you know, one of the focuses of the research that we're doing. How did you feel about answering those questions when you were going through the survey? Okay, so this participant has done a pre-survey about body image, a quantitative analysis that we've done, and then said that they were willing to expand on their questions, on their answers. So I mean, I'm quite open with my friends and my husband about that. I know things haven't gone back to the way they were, but I think it's quite important. Okay, so there's 2 different things that she's saying in this sentence. I'm quite open with my friends and my husband about that, meaning body image. So if we were to use this quote in our write-up, we would put, after the word that, we would put in square brackets, body image, because it's not obvious from the quote what the participant's talking about, but we know that that's what she's talking about because that's what we asked in the question. So she's saying, I'm quite open with my friends and my husband. Okay, so that's really important because a lot of women may not feel comfortable talking to their friends and their family about their body. This woman is saying that she is very open, and that could be very important in our data analysis. So openly discusses body image with family and friends. Participant acknowledges feeling comfortable talking about her body image with friends and her partner. And then that's completely different to anything that we've done before. So I might code that in dark blue for later on, something that might come up about having open discussions about body image.
Megan,
and we take that. Yes,
If you
Matt,
are,
go for it.
sorry, if you ask about that, so if you got video as well, or if you've done an in-person interview and you notice something there, like if they say like they're comfortable talking about it with them, but they're like, yeah, I'm comfortable talking with my husband about it, like that's very different. Yeah, I'm comfortable talking about it with my husband. Like
Yeah, very
that
good.
body language, how do you document that bit?
So that's really important to include. A lot of qualitative researchers don't like video recordings, and ethics will often say, why do you need a video recording? But yeah, that is a good point, because I, particularly in focus groups and interviews, don't like keeping field notes while I'm having a conversation with my participants, because I think it's rude and stilts the conversation. So you have to kind of rely on your memory. But when it comes to things like that, where there's like a grimace or hand over the mouth, you need to be able to document that in some way. And I would write it into the transcripts, but you need to be able to remind yourself that happens. So video recording is a really good way of doing that if you can get ethics to agree. So this mum is saying in this two completely different things. I'm quite open with my friends and my husbands about that. I know things haven't gone back to the way they were. So that's important. Like, that's an acknowledgement of, and this is where I have to be very careful, because I know the literature and I know how the discourse is going. I feel like I want to say something about bounce back ideal. So the bounce back ideal is this, it's like the thin ideal, right, in society that says that women should always be skinny. The bounce back ideal is that women should be applauded for being big during pregnancy and having bodies that are building a child. And then as soon as they hit postpartum, they have the baby, they're expected to bounce back to their pre-pregnancy size and shape. That's the bounce back ideal. I really want to call this code the bounce back ideal, but that would be me applying my biases, knowing the literature to the data, because the participant hasn't actually said that, right? So I need to think more carefully about what she's saying. So I know things haven't gone back to the way they were. So maybe postpartum body has changed. Or is different to pre-pregnancy. Participant suggests her body has not gone back to how it looked before birth. But she also doesn't say whether it was before her first child or whether it was before the last child that she had. So that's really important as well. And so we would color that in maybe purple. Does not suggest if this was before first or last pregnancy. Okay. So as you can see, this is the way that we do code labeling. And that's specifically it. As we go through, you will find that the participant starts to say similar things and you can code those in. But for an hour interview, you should have hundreds of these code labels. Hundreds of them. So if you've got like 200 code labels, don't freak out. That's probably correct. If lots of the code labels only have one quote in them, that's okay. That is how this stage works. There's no right or wrong answer. So what I'm just going to show you now is what the next stage is. So you will continue doing that line for line throughout the rest of your interview focus group or your data until you're done and you have all of your code labels. So you'll have hundreds of those. Let me just reshare the PowerPoint slide. And then the next stage is to generate those codes. Now, there's different ways of doing this. As I said before, the codes can be generated using that color coding system within NVivo. I've never done it completely in that way. Molly has a question. I'll just stop for her to ask that. Yes, Molly? It's in the chat. Let's have a look. Can you clarify if you noticed during the interview? Yes, absolutely. That implicit versus explicit data. I think they call it latent versus, it's in the book. It's in the data analysis book. Can't remember. Right. So we've generated our code labels. As I said, Robert Lingard will go through how to organize cases. This is if you have different people, different organizations, you want to know different things about the different communities. Memos, documents, and notes that you can create. You can also do really cool like word clouds of your data once it's all in and analyzed, which is really cool. You can do queries of like the most common words, the most common things said, and you can do lots of fun analysis stuff and visualizations. But Robert Lingard will go through all of those, so I'm not going to do those today. The next step after you've done all your analyzing of your code labels in NVivo is your codes and your themes. And as I said, most of the time, I use the post-it system where I write each of the code labels from NVivo on a post-it note, put it up on the wall, and then over 3 hours or so, me and the research team will move the post-its around into categories where they categorize together, they're similar or different, and then we come up with names for the codes, and then we find out the themes across those. So usually in qualitative, reflexive, thematic analysis, you'll come up with anywhere between 3 and 5 themes. 5 themes is the most common, and the themes and the theme names must be an exploration of what the participants experienced. So it's quite a common mistake to be made that the themes will be too descriptive and quite often just a statement of what the research aim or the research question is. So you have to be very careful to ensure that the theme actually comes back to what was the participants' experience of this category of codes. What were they saying in this? Not just describing what the codes are all categorized as. So that's one of the hardest things to do, I think, in thematic analysis, is coming up with those theme names. Another way of doing your coding and your theme generation is by mind mapping. People who are visual artsy people find this really good. I think people who are more logical like the post-it system. But if you have a mind that is really creative, the mind mapping system is a really good, where you like write your code labels down and into a mind map of the codes, and you use boxes and circles and end up with themes in rectangles. So there's a whole explanation of how to do the mind mapping system in the thematic analysis, a practical guide. They also go through the post-it system. So the different ways of coding and theming, theme generation are included in that. So do we have any questions about that kind of final stage of coding and thematic generation?
What would some of the examples be of like themes like that would come out of that research that you've done, as opposed to the just like the code of long words? Like,
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, I could probably, I'll unshare this and I'll see if I can find the papers that we've written. So my honours students have been working on these over the last year and a bit. So we've got 4 different studies. We've got a focus group study, we've got interview study, and then we've got an analysis of open-ended questions and surveys. So I might just open one of the thematic analysis tables and
Apologies
give
for
you an
lots of
idea.
questions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I might actually add this to the slides because, okay, let me just share the table. So once you've done your code labels, your codes and your themes, you organize them all into a table. And this is called a thematic analysis table. And they all look the same, which is great. With your code labels on one side, then your codes that they categorize into, and then your themes. So the first theme that we came up with was internal guilt and self-judgment. Mums are never the priority. And this one was all about how people put societal ideals on mums, but they're also self-judging themselves about their body image constantly. But the reason for this is because, like, mums are never the priority. They are always there to serve their partner and the child or the children. And that came out. So some of the code labels that came out of that was throwing in too much to exercise, where society says I should be looking the way I want to look. The mental load carries the weight. That was actually what we called the paper. The mental load carries the weight. The postpartum excuse, my body image is important. And these all fell underneath a code of fluctuating self-esteem and emotional struggles. So when we put all those code labels on the board, on the wall, they all seemed to describe fluctuating self-esteem and emotional struggles. So comparison to peers, frustration at how I look, happy with pregnant and postpartum body. So that was the opposite of that. So that was the negative to the positive. Resentment towards self and others. And then in that theme of mums never being the priority, there was also a code of general time management challenges. So mums talking about never having time to themselves. Life was more spacious, which is the negative to the positive. Never getting a break. Another category or code that was in that theme was having more structure and schedule pre-baby. Where mums talked about having more structure before they were pregnant. Guilt and self-judgment was also part of that theme. So I don't like the way I look. I need to be more conscious of food. I want to be skinny. I'm proud of devoting time to myself. Holding stress holds weight. No care for my body. So that was theme 1. Where's theme 2? And as you can see, there's hundreds of code labels. Theme 2 was external pressure and support, sharing postpartum expectations, shaping postpartum expectations. So this was more about external things. So friends, family, postpartum classes, community, not having any form of support was also in there. People caring about the baby, not the mum, partner stuff, partner's influence on the body, pressures from others to get back to pre-baby shape, professional help to lose weight, so doctors, medicine, things like that, social expectations, society and media influence, so social media was a big one. Then the third theme was healthy habits and self-compassion, facing judgment for diet and exercise. So mums really talked about people judging them for wanting to exercise and eat well because then they weren't spending time with the baby. So it was like the opposite thing where people were like, oh, you should be prioritizing your children instead of going to the gym. So there was things like that. So health conscious mums, different types of eating was talked about. So eating attitudes where mums were eating just what the kids left behind sometimes. Delays in eating, so they weren't eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the right times, not making eating a priority because they were prioritizing their children, making sure kids eat healthy but not themselves, not eating much, exercise stuff, food portioning, all those types of things. So as you can see, fitness apps, all sorts of stuff. Good question. And I'm happy to share that thematic table as well, if you would like, with the resources that I send through. I think there's other questions. Let's see.
So how many participants were involved in that thematic table you showed us then, Megan?
That was a focus group study. So it was only 3 focus groups with 15 participants.
Okay, yep.
So that's one of the good things about qualitative data is that sample size is not an issue.
Yeah.
You do have to justify sample size, which is quite difficult because, again, data saturation is now not a widely recommended way of doing that. So you have to read Braun and Clark and their new reasons for sample size to justify. But I've seen, like, that study in particular that we did the transcript on was one of my students during COVID, and they only got 1 participant. So we wrote her in a thesis with 1 participant and called it a case study. But also still got like a distinction.
Amazing.
So, yeah, even though we only had 1 piece of data.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the great things about qualitative research. There is no G power sample size that you have to achieve, as long as you can justify the number of participants and provide in your limitation section. Maybe you haven't really considered everybody in the population, but that's just.
But it's rich and thick.
Yeah, exactly.
Description. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Fantastic. That's really awesome. Any final comments before we wrap up today? Okay. That was fantastic, Megan. Thank you so much for sharing all your research, and I'm sure everyone's learned a great deal and their heads are full of analysis.
And then in 2 weeks, we'll start on the 4 weeks of quantitative data analysis.
Absolutely. I've been posting those links into the chat box, so hopefully we'll see everyone there. Okay. I'm going to finish the recording. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.